student am I?
Good evening, everybody, and very warm welcome to the first Hellenic Society lecture of 2020, and the roaring 20s, we all hope. We are delighted tonight to welcome Dr. Callum Maciver of Edinburgh University. He did all his degrees at Edinburgh, including an MSc, which I intend to probe further later on. And he is now a senior lecturer there, which is a feat that all students should wish to emulate, to be able to be a senior lecturer in the institution where they were first an undergraduate is a very fine thing. It shows people wanted to hang on to him. And he is an expert in later Greek literature, which I think has many pleasures, which I've not always succeeded in discovering, but which I intend to pursue further. I do work on the second sophistic, but not so much on the poetry of the later period. And Callum has published a fine book on later Greek epic, but he's also working on things that I do know about a bit, the novel and Lucian. And tonight he's going to talk about the novel. He's going to talk about generic games, the ending of Longus Daphnis and Chloe again. So, thank you, Callum.
Well, thanks very much for that very nice introduction. The title, again, isn't just because I'm rehashing the same paper all over the country. I am doing that a little bit, but I keep changing my view, but rather that lots of people have spoken about the ending of Daphnis and Chloe, and it's my turn to speak about the ending myself. This paper actually stems from my teaching. I've taught Longus a lot at Edinburgh in a Greek honours course, along with Lucian's True Histories. And the students always love Longus, not only because it's about love, but because it's about shepherds, goat herds, cheese, sheep, all sorts of things like that. What I've always found about Longus is it's puzzling because it's so simple, and because it's so sophisticated at the same time. And I've always tried to figure out what it is that causes so many people to love it. And I think this simplicity and complexity at the same time. Speaking of Edinburgh, I see a former Edinburgh honours student here in the audience, so that the pressure is definitely on, and I hope I don't disappoint my former student. Goethe, this is in the handout in the first page, loved Longus. In fact, he said that you should read it once a year, given how good it was. And he says, it was a masterpiece which sort of reached the pinnacle in terms of its understanding art and taste, in terms of what it represented, and I would tend to agree with that. Also in the handout on the first page are the other Greek novels. Longus has been probably written about more than the others. I'm going to say this unashamedly because he is the best. The others are much more popular now, especially Heliodorus, which is the longest of the novels. And I also say that the Greek of Longus is really beautiful, simple but beautiful, and beguiling in many ways as well. Okay, so what am I talking about in this paper? What's my aim? Well, essentially I want to talk about the ending and the very last sentence, because we are told, this is handout point 1, and the Greek is in bold, kai tote chloe proton emathen hotita epites hules genomena en poimenon paignia. And then Chloe, for the first time, learned that the things which had happened epites hules were the games of shepherds. Now, this is pretty confusing. And why does Longus end his novel in this way? And I will attempt to come up with a few answers, in addition to the answers that have already been given in scholarship. Now, I realise that for some of you in this audience, you may not know Longus particularly well. So in the last 2 pages of the handout, there is an appendix on the structure and content of the novel. And you may want to refer to this from time to time, but I will try to contextualise where relevant. What is Longus's Daphnis and Chloe about? Very briefly, well, it's like all Greek novels in a way. Boy meets girl, or girl meets boy. They fall in love. They become, they go through all sorts of trials and tribulations. And at the end, there's usually a marriage. And most the novels do end in marriages. Longus is slightly different in that in the other Greek novels, for example, Achilles Tatius, the boy and girl become separated. They're cast adrift across the Mediterranean, have near-death experiences, and eventually, against all the odds, come back together. Daphnis and Chloe don't really leave Lesbos, where the novel is set. There are a few incursions by pirates, sort of pirates, and there are a few abductions, but these are always underplayed and aren't taken seriously. So it's usually called the untypical novel. All of the novels are actually quite untypical in that they each claims to be doing something slightly different, but Longus is by far the most untypical novel because it is a bucolic novel. It's set in the countryside, but it's full of a literary layer that goes back to Theocritus, the bucolic poet, the Alexandrian poet. And so it's a very learned, elusive novel, which requires the type of reading in many respects that one would require of a reader of Theocritus. And there are lots of allusions to Theocritus as well. It's interesting, in this period when Longus was writing, bucolic was very popular in prose as well. So he was tapping into a literary style for that particular time. So at the moment I'm trying to finish an article on the ending, on genre and style in Longus. I began this article in 2010. And I say began, I just left it for many years, but I've been teaching it a lot. And the students have really brought me to the answers that I am seeking if I found the answers. And so at last I'm going to try and get this finished, and I will thank the students in a footnote. Okay, so what about the last sentence? So essentially, secondary literature says that what we get in the last sentence is a sphragus, a seal, a sort of a signature by the author on his work, which is typical of classical works. I should point out the most important thing I forgot to tell you about the plot is that Daphnis and Chloe fall in love and want to have sex, but they don't know how. So they go through all sorts of adventures and experiences as they try to figure out what to do to consummate their desires. And by the end of the novel, right at the very end, they do consummate their desire, but we don't get to see it. And so in the last sentence, all we're told is that, so I'll probably just go through the first handout, the first point on the handout point 1. But what we're told is something that didn't happen. So these were the things they named and carried out later. This is handout point 1. So what they actually do is they return to the countryside. We get a glimpse into their future lives. They have children, and they reject the city for the countryside. In the plot, they are found by rustic people and are brought up. They're found exposed with objects left with them, sort of tokens of that pertain to their aristocracy, and these rustic people bring them up, and then by the end of the novel, the true parents arrive in the rustic world, and there are recognition scenes, and they are reunited with their parents. But even after that, once they realise that these are aristocratic urbanites, they return to the countryside to live their lives together happily for the rest of their lives. But then you would think that was the ending, but it's not, because then we get the marriage night. But these were the things they named and carried out later. Then when night fell, everyone escorted them to the bedroom, some playing the pipes, others the flute, and others holding aloft the great torches. And when they were outside the door, they sang with a voice that sounded harsh and ungentle, as though they were breaking up the earth with forks and not singing the wedding song. Daphnis and Chloe lay down together naked, embraced and kissed, and stayed up all night, longer than even owls. And Daphnis did something of the things, kai edrase ti Daphnis hon auton, epai deuse, Lacanion. Daphnis did something of the things Lacanion had taught him, and then Chloe learnt for the first time that the things that happened in the wood were shepherds' games. So right at the end, we get a veil put over their marriage night. But what we're told is quite clearly it was a happy night because they were up longer than even owls. So we can imagine they were happy that particular night. We get just about enough information to understand that they did indeed have sex after waiting all of this time. And then we're told that Chloe learnt something. Now, Chloe, as we'll see in this paper, is in many ways the focus of the novel, and in fact, the myth of the novel. And so when we're told at the end that Chloe learnt something, we have to discover what this something is. What were these games of shepherds in the woods? Connected to that, and as I will try to argue, Chloe represents in many ways the reader. We're told at the beginning of the novel we're going to learn something, and then by the end of the novel we ask ourselves, well, what have we learnt in the person of Chloe? So this would be the direction of my paper. Now, in terms of secondary literature, I tried to keep the handout on the smallish side. I realise it's massive. So I'll read out some of the views on the ending. Now, Jack Winkler, who is on the bibliography, was particularly disturbed by the ending of Daphnis and Chloe and by the whole novel. He saw in this novel that there was an inherent violence in sex for women. And the ending, which talks about a harsh and discordant song, and the fact that we're not told exactly what happened in the marriage chamber, seems to represent a continuation of the violence towards women that's seen in some of the mythical tales within the novel. This is something I disagree with entirely. I'm actually not going to talk about that in this paper. It's quite clear that the ending is happy, and the reason that they are sounding so discordant is because they're rustics singing a song that doesn't sound like the type of song you would normally hear. Others, such as Zeitlin, states, I think this is probably correct, that sex is something that is to be conducted decorously in the privacy of the bedchamber, and over whose potentially traumatic enactment the text finally casts a discreet veil. And then Morgan, 2004, who is the most sensible, I think, in terms of scholars who have written about the ending, says, pain and blood are absent, and the sleepless night denotes joyfully repeated and mutually satisfying lovemaking. The final sentence does not mean that sex is the opposite of play, but that its pleasures are more profound. So I'm not really going to be talking about that very much at all. The ending is happy, and Chloe is happy and is receiving no trauma, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so how are we to understand the ending? How are we to understand exactly what Chloe learnt? So if you move, bear with me, we'll go through the handout. What I want to emphasise first is the didactic nature of the novel. So in handout point 2, I move straight to Lacanion, who is an erotodidaskalos. Now there are two teachers of love, praeceptor amoris, erotodidaskalos, personae in the novel. The first one is Philetus, whom I won't discuss in this talk. He appears in book 2. Philetus, of course, is the founder of bucolic poetry, the predecessor of Theocritus. And so we have within the novel someone called Philetus who appears, who instructs Daphnis and Chloe about the nature of Eros. And his description of Eros is in particular very philosophical and poetical and allusive. So he's the sort of bucolic figure who appears to try and help Daphnis and Chloe along the way in their journey towards knowledge of what sex is. The second one, who appears in book 3, is Lacanion, little she-wolf, who is very unlike Philetus in that she is cast in the figure of the gold-hearted prostitute of new comedy, the little she-wolf, who has sex with Daphnis. Now I remember being taught Longus when I was an undergraduate, and the person who taught us asked us if we thought that this was unfair, that Daphnis got to have sex and find out what this was, and Chloe did not find out what sex was. And also, had Daphnis betrayed Chloe in doing this? And I found that I was the only one in the class that thought that Daphnis had betrayed Chloe. So I was obviously very innocent back then. So I'll just go through the Lacanian passage, because Lacanian, of course, is mentioned in the very last paragraph of the novel. Just before we get, and then Chloe learnt for the first time, we're told that Daphnis did something of the things that Lacanian had taught him. So Lacanian is emphasised right at the end of the novel. Why? Will this help us understand what Chloe learnt for the first time and what we learn for the first time? So, and when the erotic education had been accomplished, telestheses dites erotikes paedagogias. So a lot of this is put in Platonic terms, something I'll discuss in a minute. Daphnis, still with his rustic way of thinking, was all set to run to Chloe and do right away all the things he had learnt, as though he feared that he would forget if he delayed. When Lacanian, holding him back, spoke to him as follows: "It is yet necessary for you to learn these other matters, Daphnis. When Chloe does this sort of wrestling with you, she will scream out and cry and lie in a pool of blood. But do not fear the blood, but whenever it is that you persuade her to give herself to you, lead her to this place." Now, what is this place? It's the deepest part of the woods, as we'll see in a later passage. The woods are central to my argument in this paper, the mention of the woods at the end. So it's a place that Daphnis associates with danger for Chloe, or violence. Lead her to this place so that no one may hear if she shouts, and no one may see if she weeps, and if she bleeds, she can wash in the spring. And do not forget that I have made you a man before Chloe. Daphnis fell to reasoning over the things she had said, and was checked from his earlier eagerness, and hesitated to pester Chloe further than a kiss and an embrace, not wanting her to shout as though at an enemy, nor to cry as though in pain, nor to bleed as though she had been murdered. As a beginner, Artimathes, he feared the blood and thought it would come only from a wound. Deciding to enjoy the usual pleasures with her, he left the wood. So it would have been a very short novel if Daphnis had just run off and had sex with Chloe, the end, but it is delayed. And it's shortly after this episode that the novel moves into a much more new comic world. So up until this point, it's been much more of a bucolic world, but in book 4, so there are 4 books, the fourth book, in the fourth book, the city people arrive to inspect the countryside, and they are all cast in new comedy ways, which I will talk about soon. So Daphnis is the one who learns sex first ahead of Chloe, and it's after this point that the focus is much more on Daphnis rather than Chloe as well. But it's Chloe at the end that Emathan learnt something for the first time. So Daphnis gets education, but what about Chloe? I just want to point out, because it'll be relevant for my paper as I carry on, the part that I've underlined in Handout Point 2, and do not forget that I have made you a man before Chloe. Now, this is one of these occasions in scholarship where you think you found something that no one else has found. But unfortunately, Ewan Bowie in 2019 published his long-awaited commentary on Longus, and right enough, he had found the allusion to Odyssey 8, 461-2, which is just at the end of this passage. So what Lacanian, the little she-wolf, golden-hearted prostitute figure, says at the end of her speech is a set of words that allude to Nausicaa in Book 8, in the very final words of Nausicaa in Book 8, where Nausicaa says, "Farewell, stranger, and remember me once you're back in your native land, that I'm the one you owe your life to, first and foremost." If you look at the Greek, there's similarities. So Lacanian's speech episode ends with Nausicaa. As we'll see in a minute, the episode begins with Lacanian as Penelope. So Lacanian is ending with the words of a Parthenos who hasn't had sex. So there's some sort of comic play and reversal going on, which should be important for my purposes. Going back to the preface, the very beginning of the novel, and Longus is one of the few, or the only, that has this type of preface, a very separate historiographical type of preface. The narrator, in the guise of Longus the author, tells us that he saw images while he was visiting the countryside. And as I looked and wondered, this is handout point 3, a strong urge, pothos, which is also the word for sexual desire, gripped me to respond to the image in writing. So after seeking out an exegete of the image, I laboured to produce 4 books, which are the books that we have in our hands. An offering to Eros and the nymphs and Pan, a possession for pleasure for all people, katema deterpnon, pasin anthropos, which I tried in my translation to allude to the possession for ever, in the words possession for pleasure, of Thucydides 1:22 in his programmatic passage, which will heal those love sick, which will assuage those love hurt, will remind the once loved, and will educate the not yet loved. For no one at all fled or will flee Eros, as long as beauty exists and eyes see, but may the god grant us sophrosyne to write about the things of others. Hemin ho theos paraskoi sophronusin taton alon graphin. So we as readers are told we're going to learn something. Either we're going to learn about love for the first time, or if we've fallen out of love, we're going to fall back in love, is the purpose of this novel. So there's a didactic message. Now, we can't for a moment think that this is serious. This is not a sex manual. We're not going to learn anything, but we are going to be reminded about the ways of love through its literary guise. There is also a hint at, I think, the much more explicit novels that don't survive from this time, much more, don't say pornographic, but in that direction, which would provide titillation for the educated reader. And so we're getting a hint, if we need sophrosyne, as we read this novel, what is going to come our way? Are we going to get insight into things that are more graphic than we expect? But excuse the pun, this is no graphic novel. So we're told that we're going to learn something. This is set up at the beginning by Longus, and it's brought up right at the end of the novel. So I'm pushing my point away further and further away down the road, but I'll eventually get there. In the passage above, in handout point 2, we saw the interaction of Daphnis with Lacanian. What led him there? Well, he experiences aporia, which of course is the thing that all interlocutors of Socrates have to come to. They have to realise that they know nothing. So think of Plato's Meno. Meno has to realise he is completely wrong about his previously held views, and it's only at that point that Socrates can lead him to a knowledge of the truth. So Daphnis experiences a type of aporia before Lacanian comes along. So she's actually like a Socratic figure as well, who's going to educate Daphnis. One of the key themes of Longus, which is not on the handout and I won't have time to go into much, is the idea of physis, nature, and techne, artificial skill, artifice, if you like. And what Daphnis and Chloe have plenty of is physis, so they imitate what they see in nature, but they need someone to come along and teach techne, the specific skill that will lead Daphnis and Chloe to have sex. And this is what Daphnis actually gets with Lacanian. So let's read handout point 4. Lying down beside her, he lay there for a long time, not knowing how to do any of the things he was swelling to do. He made her stand up and embraced her from behind in imitation of the goats. So Daphnis is getting quite frustrated. Chloe pointed out to him, we can't really imitate the goats because they've got their coats on, they're woolly. And so we can't take her clothes off, we must keep her clothes on, is the idea. They get very confused. But this made him more at a loss than ever. And sitting down, he wept to think that when it came to the deeds of love, he was more stupid than even the rams. Polydemallon aporethes, Kathisas eklaen ekai krion amathesteros esta erotos erga. And as I say every time I mention this passage in class or in a talk, Daphnis, you silly Billy. And I don't apologise. So Daphnis gets to this point of being completely at a loss, and a Socratic figure comes along in a comic guise, Lacanian, and has sex with him, as we will see, sort of. So what about Chloe? Well, Chloe does receive instruction. In fact, she is the focal point of instruction. She's the instructee. She is the one that is told or hears specifically 3 inset tales or myths. Now, there's 4 books. There's an inset tale in book 1, another one in book 2, and another one in book 3. There isn't one in book 4, which I think is important. I've listed these under handout point 5. Now, it's interesting that in section A on the handout and in section B, so the fata, the wood pigeon inset tale, and the echo inset tale, it's Daphnis who recounts the myth to Chloe. He is the instructor and she is the instructee. So he already has a role of superior knowledge to Chloe. And if you look at handout point 5a, you'll notice that Chloe is seeking to learn what the fata is saying, and then Daphnis explains the myth, the sounds of behind the sounds of the wood pigeon. Chloes zetuses mathin hoti, which very much resembles our final sentence of the novel. So she's seeking to inquire, she's seeking to learn, and then she is taught. The second inset tale in book 2 is not narrated by Daphnis, but what's important to recognise is the fact that the myths, the inset tales, increase in violence as the novel goes on. The first one, there's only vague hints at violence, but each inset tale involves a virgin, a parthenos, who is just at the point of transition to becoming a gune, becoming a woman. Chloe, of course, is just at this point. So these inset tales or myths seem to represent paradigms for Chloe. And so she is hearing these myths, she is learning from them. What do they tell her about her own experience, her own life, and what she has to do? The third one in book 3, told by Daphnis, occurs just after the Lacanian episode, and it's interesting, it's the most violent and involves sparagmos, splitting apart of the limbs, which seems to reflect the thinking of Daphnis at this point in his particular worry. You would expect, therefore, an inset tale in book 4, given that they're so central in each of the first 3 books, and we don't get one. I want to argue just now that the 4th inset tale is either in book 4 or the whole novel is the 4th inset tale. So if you look at handout point 6, one of the key passages for the whole novel is 6a. Chloe has been abducted by the Methymnians, who will become relevant soon, and Pan appears to the captain of the ship in which Chloe is found, and he says, sorry, I've missed out the translation here, you have dragged away from the altars a Parthenon, a virgin, a maiden, from whom Eros wishes to make a mythos, a story. So we have the 3 myths, and here is the myth of Chloe. So when we get to book 4, do we expect something similar to happen to Chloe? Another thing that I have to mention for each of the 3 inset tales, the virgins, the girls, are threatened by male violence, especially in the second and third one, and escape through metamorphosis. They become something else. So the wood pigeon, the girl who is called Fata, becomes a wood pigeon to escape suggested violence. In book 2, Syrinx becomes a reed, from where we get the musical instrument, and in so doing escapes the threatened rape of Pan, and in the third one, Echo herself becomes an echo to escape Pan. So threatened rape, attempted rape, and the only way they can escape in this rustic literary world is through metamorphosis. Chloe, as representing a myth, therefore seems to be in some sort of inherent danger in this rustic world in which she lives, And of course, by the time she gets to the end of the novel, because her future life is consummated through marriage, she escapes, apparently, the inherent dangers of the rustic world because she has become part of this institutionalized ritual of marriage. She's now safe within the institution of marriage, is the common argument. There may be a metamorphosis, though, and this is in 6b. So she's, after the recognition scene, and she's reunited with her father, she is washed, her hair is combed, and she suddenly appears in front of everyone. Then it was possible to see what beauty really is when it takes on adornment, hotan kosmon pros labe, which seems to be a message from the narrator too, that once you add adornment, cosmos, which of course is a literary critical term in ancient rhetorical thought, when you add cosmos to something that is raw and material, you can make it something really beautiful. For Chloe, clothed with her hair brushed and face washed, appeared to all so much more beautiful that even Daphnis himself scarcely recognised her. So she seems to have gone through some sort of transformation from rustic Parthenos to urbanite, to something that's been prettified, something from the city. So this is as close we come to a metamorphosis. But really, the metamorphosis is escaped because of the marriage at the end. And for me, the whole of Longus's 4 books are the mythos of Chloe. We see her journey, the threats from male violence that she manages to escape, and then the ending where she is safe within marriage is one of the key points of the novel. But I'm not as interested in that. I'm more interested in the hidden message of Longus and the hidden message about what his novel is and what he is trying to do. So we're already on to handout point 7. Chloe and the woods. So on handout point 1, as I've already said, Chloe learned for the first time that the paignia of shepherds, so the things that happened in the woods were the games of shepherds. So why the mention of hule at the end of the novel? Why is it so important? I'm going to mention now that epites hules, epi plus the genitive of hule, isn't used anywhere else by Longus. It's only at this particular point. Daphnis and Chloe never try anything in the woods. It's always on the edge of the woods. And it's interesting that John Morgan, in his translation, translates the final sentence as, Chloe learned that the things that happened on the edge of the woods were the games of shepherds. Now that's bending the Greek too much for my liking, because if you look up other instances of epites hules, it tends to mean in the countryside, epag agroikias, or in a particular region is how it is emphasised. It seems to be local. It is possible to have on the edge of, but it's a bit of a stretch. So it seems to be that in the woods is the key. Now, the woods is a place of safety as well as a place of danger. And it's a place of safety for Chloe. It's where you run when danger arrives. And so in the Syrinx para-narrative, Syrinx runs into the woods and is turned into reeds. Chloe and Daphnis mime the Syrinx episode. They imitate it. They carry it out after it has been sung to them. And Chloe goes on her tiptoes and then runs into the woods, escaping Pan in the person of Daphnis. So it's downplayed in a comic way. But notice that Chloe men eisten hulen hos es helos kryptatai. Chloe took the woods to hide as though into a marsh. Now, this becomes more significant in 4:14. In book 4, as I've already said, the new comic people arrive. This fantastically mystical, otherworldly, rustic locus, which we've been reading up to this point, is then overrun by these city people who have names like Eudramus, the messenger, good at running, Gnathon, who is a parasite who eats the things of others, from the Greek for jaw, who is a pederast as well. And so all of the names seem to reflect actual names used in New Comedy of the Hellenistic era. The first time I ever read Longus, I was so disappointed with book 4 because I was so in love with this rustic idyll, and suddenly it was awash with new comic people. I'm giving a very strong sense that I was very naive when I was younger. But anyway, so when these people arrive, in chapter 14 of book 4, Chloe fled then into the woods. 4:14. Chloe men un eisten hulen efugen. Feeling idols at such a huge crowd and being afraid. Idesthesa kai phobethesa. But Daphnis stood his ground. Daphnis, with his newfound education, with his seemingly superior knowledge to Chloe, stands his ground in the face of this influx of new comic people. But Chloe runs away. So it's a vital site in the novel. And this is still in the handout. This is page 4 of the handout at the top. Morgan tells us that Chloe's modesty is now a narrative convenience. It gets her out of the way for Daphnis' recognition scene, enabling a double recognition scene. So for Morgan, we need Chloe out of the way so we can concentrate on Daphnis. Now, strictly speaking, the language used of Chloe's escape into the woods very closely resembles the escape of her when she was imitating Syrinx into the woods in the face of danger. So the new comic world represents danger for Chloe from which she must escape. And she eventually comes back towards the end of the novel. Now, I've already said that Chloe is the mythos. I'm not the only one that says this. Pan within the novel says this, that Eros wants to make a mythos of Chloe. Now, Chloe, because she's so closely linked with the insect tales, she's told the insect tales, but in each case, we're told that, there was a Parthenos, just like you, Parthene. So just like you, maiden, virgin, there was a virgin. So there's close approximation between the two. And these are bucolic figures that are in danger of violence. And then we have the bucolic figure, Chloe. So for me, Chloe represents the bucolic world more than any other figure. And it's Chloe that at the end that is learning something. She runs away from the new comic invasion in book 4, and it's only at the end that we get some sort of resolution. You're already probably getting a sense that I'm going a bit meta with this, but it's going to get worse. So, how does the ending resolve the split, as it were, between the bucolic world and the new comic world that seemed to be in rivalry or tension throughout the novel? So I'll give you a sense of this bucolic versus new comic tension on handout point 8. Now, Effe, it's a translation in 1999 of his original German article, wrote about the bucolization of the novel, or rather the epization of the bucolic. And by epization, he meant new comedy, because, of course, the new comedy is connected to epic. And in fact, the novel, the Greek novel, has its roots in new comedy and epic. So there are two traditions here. And so which one is it? For Effe, it was the triumph of the bucolic, that Longus is emphasizing and promoting the bucolic strand of what he's trying to do, as opposed to the new comic world. What's so wonderful in Longus is that this narrator, who is apparently an urbanite, seems to make fun of the city people who arrive in the country world. And they seem to have an idealized view of the countryside that is undercut by the rustics themselves. And the rustics are far more sophisticated than they think. And this always reminds me of one of my favourite films by Bill Forsyth, Local Hero, the same director who did Gregory's Girl, where of course the Texans arrive and fall in love with the west of Scotland, whereas the locals just want their money. And this is constantly the case in Longus, in that the rustics are money mad. And in fact, the adoptive parents of Daphnis and Chloe want to make as much money as possible out of their aristocratic roots and heritage. And that does, to an extent, happen at the end. Well, they don't receive money, but Daphnis and Chloe are reunited. Now, the Methymnians, this is 8b, are pleasure-seeking young men who take boats out to the countryside from the city to hunt, to fish, to sail, and to pleasure. Basically, they're pleasure-seeking young men. in book 2, a rustic comes along and steals the cable that attaches the ship to the shore, because, of course, in the countryside, you make use of anything that you have to hand. And so what the Methymnians do is tie up the boat with some the types of things you find at the shore. So not seaweed, but I can't think of the word. Not foliage either, but strong shoots. You get the idea, to tie the boat. And a goat comes along and eats it, and the boat drifts away. And they blame the first person they come across is Daphnis. They beat him up. And then there's a trial, because Philetus comes along, this rustic, learned rustic, sort of a poet-like figure, to be judge. And there's a sort of a debate, an agon, and Daphnis wins. And so triumphs over the seemingly sophisticated Methymnians. This is hand at point B, number 1. Protoi de kategorun hoi Methymnaioi zaphe kai syntoma bukolon echontes dikasten. The Methymnians spoke first, clearly and succinctly, given they had, as a judge, a cowherd. So in their snobbish view, they thought that this poor Bukolos was not going to understand what they were trying to say, so they kept it simple. Daphnis is rhetorically far superior and overcomes the urbanites and triumphs. So, if you like, this is symbolises the triumph of the bucolic world over the urban world. And in fact, once Philetus adjudges Daphnis to be the victor, the Methymnians are stirred up by their anger and seize Daphnis in their desire to bind him. At this point, the countrymen, roused to anger, leapt on them like starlings or jackdaws and quickly seized Daphnis, who was putting up a fight himself, back again, and turned them to flight by raining down blows with their cudgels. Now, leaping like starlings or jackdaws is an allusion to starling and jackdaw similes in the Iliad. This is Iliad 16, 583, and Iliad 17, 755. Now, it's usually the people running away in fear that are compared to starlings or jackdaws. But here we have it reversed. They swoop down, so it's usually the Trojans running away from the Achaeans, but here it's the country people who swoop down like starlings and jackdaws on these urbanites. So there's already a reversal of the trope. So you would expect the urbanites to win at the debate, you expect them to have the upper hand of the rustics, but everything is reversed. There seems to be a literary game by Longus in which the rustic people are superior to the urban people. And the same is true of hand at point 8c. I've already mentioned this, that we have a glimpse into the future, that they want to have a wedding in the countryside, and in fact they want to live in the countryside. So the next morning they agreed to ride back to the countryside, for this is what Daphnis and Chloe begged for, since they were no longer able to endure life in the city, and they thought it would be a good idea to make their wedding a bucolic one. The guests included Lamon and Myrtile, Dryas and Nape, Dorcon's family, Philetus, the sons of Philetus, Chromis, and Lacanian. This has been rightly called a curtain call, that you get all of the characters in the seeming play, and they all appear at the end. Even the goats nearby were grazing as if they too were joining in with the festivities. This was not at all to the liking of the townsfolk. Astikois upanoterpnon en. So this is not at all to the liking of the urbanites, who had an idealised, and this is emphasised in terpnon, view of the countryside, which is of course so important in a philosophical discourse. So the narrator seems to be making fun of the townsfolk. I argue this in an article which is coming out, it's a self-promotion this year in CQ, about the narrator in Longus. Okay, I think I've given enough background. I want to go back to the beginning to hand at point 1. And to the final sentence, before I move away from the final sentence again. And we can look at it closely. Kai edrase ti Daphnis hon auton epai deuse Lacanian. Now, just before this bit, we get the fact that they lay down together and embraced each other and kissed. So they lay down together naked, gumnoi, sung cataclithentes, periebalon, allelus kai kataphilon. I haven't put this on the handout, but the instructions that Philetus, this other instructor in love, gave them were these very instructions, but with the order the other way round. So what we have here at the end is a reminiscence of Philetus in Book 2, the first erotodidaskalos. Then we get a reminiscence, or an actual statement of the mention of the other erotodidaskalos, Lacanian. So we have the more rustic person first, and the more urbanite person second, emphasised, with name Lacanian, the little she-wolf. Then we get kai tote chloe proton emathen hotita epites hules genomena en poimenon paignia. Now the ending, of course, is were the games of shepherds, or of shepherds, the games. Poimenon paignia is, as I've already said, I think, a sphragus, a signature, and it was in fact the title of the short poems of Philetus, the founder of bucolic poetry. This is in fact on handout point 7E. Handout point 7E on page 5. The title of the short poems of Philetus, of course, were these very words. Theocritus is also handout point E. Interestingly, it was described as the composer of shepherdly paignia. So seemingly what Longus is ending with is an emphasis on the bucolic world through the use of paignia. So I'm going to show just now, just in a second, paignion, however, means something else as well. I'll show right now. So we go back to handout point 7, bottom of page 3, I think. Bottom of page 4, paignia. Morgan rightly states, he wrote this commentary in Longus Daphnis and Chloe, that this is a literary term. It is packed with literary significance. I think because Longus ends with an encoding of meaning that reaches beyond the text to something different, to the author himself and what he was trying to do, and to the actual writing down of these types of works, I think we can look for encoding in the rest of the sentence. So let's look at paignia first. So paignia not only refers to the bucolic literary world, but also refers to the new comic world, or to comedy. We get this in Plato's Laws. This is handout 9b, and also in reference in Suetonius and elsewhere, that to paignion is a comedy, a title of a comedy. It's thrown in as well Gorgias, the encomium of Helen, where paignion can also be a rhetorical literary game where you're doing all sorts of things with tradition and perhaps reversing what is expected. What I want to argue now, what is the basic point of my paper that I've been postponing, is that what Longus is doing is he's saying that I've been having games all along. I've had the bucolic world, I've had the new comic world, and I've brought them together in a literary, sophisticated game. Did you get it? So when we get Chloe at the end saying she learned for the first time that something happened, because Chloe is so often the instructee in the novel, and because we're told in the preface that we're going to be instructed about something, we can see ourselves in the last sentence, and we should question, what have we learnt? Well, we've learnt that the paignia, poimenon, that the things that happened on the edge of the woods or in the woods, were the paignia poimenon. Now, strictly speaking, this is back to handout point 1, if I can find it. What has always puzzled me is the genitive, epites, hules, and also the reference to in the woods as opposed to elsewhere, because for Chloe, she didn't get up to anything with Daphnis in the woods. And I like to see hules, or hule, as referring not just to the woods, but to material. Hule, like the Latin silva. So Longus has been having games in subject matter, in literary material, epites, hules. So the things that happened in subject matter, with reference to subject matter, were specifically paignia poimenon, were games, paignia. and I'm pretty sure I'm right, but I want to convince you more. The paignion, the word for game or literary play or title of bucolic works, refers equally to the new comic world as much as it does to the bucolic world. If you look at handout point, I'm going to skip actually to Plutarch, to handout point G on page 6, and I owe this reference to Kostas Paniotakis of great fame. I always find that all good things come from Glasgow anyway. But here we have Plutarch. Kostas pointed me to this passage because, of course, he works on mime, and we have Plutarch experts in the audience, so I'll tread carefully. And this is from the table talk, 712E2F. And here's my adapted translation of mimes, mimoi. I said, some are narrative representations, and some are farces, paignia, i.e. low comedy. Neither of these are fit for a dinner party, something I entirely disagree with. The hypotheses, by reason of their length and equipment, and the farces, because they are so full of scurrilous and trivial low comedy, bomologia. I think bomologia in LSJ is translated tomfoolery. And not fit to be seen by the slaves that fetch your shoes if their masters show a sense of propriety, sophronunton. So if they've got any sense of sophrosyny, their masters won't let their slaves near it. Of course, we are the readers that have been keeping a sense of sophrosyny by the time we come to the end of this novel. Yet the rabble, even with their wives and young sons, even when their wives and young sons are in the company, are spectators of such mimeta, of deeds and words which are more apt to disturb the soul than any drink. Typo. And there seems to be a reference to Epicureanism here with tarachodesteron tas psychas, in terms of ataraxia. So it's quite clear that paignia in the era of Plutarch refers to low comedy, mimes, the types of things that Kostas Paniotakis works on. Now, are there any other references to this in Longus? And of course the answer is yes. This is handout point F. Back across the page on page 5, the beginning of the Lacanian episode that I've been keeping from you. Now, I have omitted the sex. This is not because I belong to the Victorian era, but only because I didn't need to talk about it. But you can go and read it in your own time. The next day, so Lacanian has been watching Daphnis and Chloe attempt to do all sorts of things, always to no avail. And so he thinks, I've got an opportunity to both have sex with Daphnis and help him on his education. So the next day, using as a pretext, so Laben shouldn't be there, using as a pretext that she was off to visit the woman who was having a baby, she went openly to the oak at which Daphnis and Chloe sat, and on arrival mimed accurately a woman in distress. Mime samene ten taragmenen. So she mimed accurately. We are being led to this stage. Lacanian, as the she-wolf, as the new comic figure, most obviously, puts on a stage performance and manages to convince Daphnis to run off with her into the woods. Saying, save me, Daphnis, in my time of trouble. For of the 20 geese that belong to me, an eagle has snatched one away, the fairest of them, and given the weight of the freight he was carrying, he was not able to bring it to his accustomed rock up on high, but has fallen to earth with it into the deepest part of the woods here. In the article, once it's properly written, I think there's lots of literary critical terms here as well, because what we're getting is epic parody. We're getting a parody of Penelope, of course, who had the dream of the geese. So Lacanian begins with the Odyssey, the ultimate virtuous woman, Penelope, the Gune, and ends her speech with the ultimate virtuous Parthenos, Nausicaa, from Book 8. So the Odyssey at the beginning and end. So this is epic parody. And I think the terms meteoros, hypselen, and tapenen are all referring to high genre or high literary genre and bringing it down to low genre, because these words, I mean, they're all in Longinus, but that's not the answer, but used a lot in terms of these signifiers of literary level. So I'll finish the story, finish this bit of the handout. I beg you then, in the name of the nymphs and Pan there, the statues that were there, come with me into the woods, for I'm afraid to go alone, and save my goose for me, and do not overlook the fact that my numbers are not complete. There seems to be something encoded going on there as well. So here what we have is a typical new comic epic parody, and then followed by a mocking of Daphnis who wants to rush off. And so we have a mixing of genre, but clearly we as sophisticated readers are laughing with Daphnis because we understand what Lacanian is up to. So how do we therefore understand the ending, given that these are games of shepherds that took place in terms of their subject matter? So I am now going to read a conclusion, and we're almost there. In this paper I have attempted to give an insight into only a few of the functions of the final sentence. Longus's novel does not give easy answers, and the deliberate obfuscation in the final moments of the text, at the very moment when readers expect to read about the completion, the telos, the finding of the sexual act by Chloe, consummated with Daphnis, has led to a number of complex and varying interpretations over the last few decades. What Longus certainly does give us is the following: a happy ending. The glimpse into the future in the penultimate paragraph proves that. Clear proof that Daphnis and Chloe enjoy themselves in the wedding night, all night, and a continuation of the Sophrosyne prayed for in the preface. This is not an explicit novel, but it leaves some further encoding for us to uncode. If that's a word. We must answer the questions: what has Chloe learnt? What have we learnt that Chloe learned? And what have we learned? And what are these games of shepherds? And why does Longus emphasise the woods? The pairing of new comedy with shepherds, so poimenon, paignia, symbolises the symbiotic experiment of Longus. He's paired in novel form two strands, one of which, comedy, is a literary progenitor of the novel, along with epic and historiography, and another form, bucolic, very popular in Longus's time, as authors such as Alciphron prove. In this article I'm writing at the moment, I discuss the mixing of the two facets of the novel, and I believe, as I've tried to argue, that the woods, so often a site of refuge from danger, symbolises the world of the mythos of Chloe, the bucolic symbol, but further should be translated with this other designation of subject matter, like the Latin silva. Longus has experimented with the traditional novel by creating this bucolic hybrid, and the apparent tension throughout between the comic urban and the bucolic rustic were the mere generic games of a playful author. This is what we realise when we unpack the encoding within this essentially happy ending. This is what we have learned seemingly for the first time, but of course not for the first time. The city visitors are mocked, and often the rustics triumph. But the reverse is also true. We laugh at, for example, at the naivety of Daphnis. Chloe, for the first time, has understood her place in her own mythos, namely that through the institutionalised, accepted sphere of marriage, she can accept the dangers apparently inherent in the countryside. She can escape, the dangers apparently inherent in the countryside. What the reader symbolised in the education of Chloe realises is that this has been a literary and generic experiment in subject matter and creativity. The final word, paignia, emphasises the comic stage, and Lacanian's comic performance, given that she's emphasised right at the end there, and given that paignia is the final word of the novel, her comic performance, which has brought the literary techne to the bucolic phusis in a happy literary marriage. But in the world of Daphnis and Chloe, sex, the domain of the comic world, the key component, the telos, is exactly why we have Lacanian and why Lacanian is emphasised, and why paignia has the emphatic position at the end of the novel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Callum. That was great. Very interesting and very convincing. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. I'm going to rudely kick off myself. and ask you about what you see the relationship of the novel to Ovid being. You need to come up here to answer. Sorry.
So the relationship of the novel to Ovid?
Yes, please.
None. Were these Greek readers reading Latin? Is a huge question. I mean, I think there's a strong possibility, and I think I can see the clear Ovidian paths within Longus. Absolutely. I mean, what scholars usually say is there's all of this Hellenistic poetry that's lost, that Ovid was probably using. My answer is I don't know. I think we, as Ovidian readers, see Ovid, and I think. So I'm trying to be polite, other than just saying no, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I mean I always think it's very interesting, and I never know how much Greeks are reading Latin either. And I certainly think if you'd said the words Latin poetry to Plutarch, he would probably have said Latin what. But although he does clearly seem to have read some Horace, so I'm just wondering if there's a possibility that there's some crossover there. Sorry, go on.
I think Plutarch is clearly a special case in that we get far more information about him. And I think that given that Longus might not even have been called Longus, because in some of the manuscripts we have Logos, who knows, it probably was from that part of the world. I just think, so when going to the other stuff I work on, Imperial Greek poetry, a lot of people are trying to say that Nonnus, the 5th century poet who wrote this huge 48-book poem about Dionysus, must have read the Metamorphoses because they're so similar in what they do. I think that possibly Nonnus had read the Metamorphoses, possibly even in a Greek translation, because we have bilingual papyri of Virgil, for example, and obviously there was a lot of Latin learning happening. But in terms of, to use German, Erwartungshorizont, I don't see why. What would Nonnus be getting out of this by embedding Latin poetry that very, very, very few people are going to get? And I think with the Greek novels, with Longus being one of the most clever, I still don't quite see what the specific point is, given that his other literary allusions are so, well, they spring out to us. It may be a difference between the two languages, and we don't quite get them. Yeah.
Thank you. I think perfectly reasonable view. Can I ask if open it up to the floor now? And if you have a question, if you can please wait for the microphone, which will wing its way towards you, so that your question and the answer can be recorded for posterity. Yes, at the back there. Thank you.
Hi, Callum. If there's this sort of fusion in the book between comic and bucolic, or rather, I think, did you say that in the end you think bucolic wins? Is it a sort of? I didn't
make that clear.
Yeah.
No.
Is it like a fusion, or is there not one? After all?
It seems to be the case that there's a triumphing of the bucolic because they marry there, they bring up their kids, that they actually allow their kids to be suckled by animals, which is an unusual form of abuse. Crazy. Students always laugh at that, I remember. But there is a return to this idealised bucolic world in the story of the novel. But at the end, the emphasis placed on paignia, on comedy, on mime, and the very careful sense in the last sentence. I used to think that the bucolic triumphed. That's what I taught, but I don't think that anymore.
There's obviously quite a lot of it.
There's a lot. It's just a happy marriage is what I would like to call it, like the happy marriage at the end. And what he's pointing to is, well, what I've been leading you along all along. What you learnt was essentially that I've created a novel that's unlike any other, and it's bucolic and new comic at the same time. And in fact, this has been my game itself in the kind of Gorgias sense, but the emphasis on Lacanian, the name, brings mime and comedy to the fore, and especially since paignia as a word on its own refer to that too. But also, of course, is the title of the poetry of Philetus. So I don't think he's pushing one ahead of the other. He's just showing that they are together in the last sentence. And while there's a sense that maybe one is going to triumph over the other, I think the lesson of the last sentence is we shouldn't be looking for that. And I probably fell into the trap myself.
He's being clever.
Yeah. So was that your question?
Yeah.
I taught Angus, and he's probably used to being interrupted.
Thank you, Callum, for your wonderful paper, and I'm really sorry I'm going to ask you this question. But how typical or atypical is Longus's treatment of sex in this novel compared to his contemporaries or predecessors?
It's really interesting. Quite untypical, actually. It's quite surprising in the novels that survive what we actually get in the sex bit of Lacanian. Now, a lot of people there's various editions right up to the early 20th century where that bit was missed out. Yeah. Now, if you actually read it, and I've omitted it, what's actually said is that Lacanian noticed that Daphnis was already swollen, and she led him along the path that he was already on, something along those lines, and nature took over. So she just really had to show him the way, and the rest, he presto, was done. So it's actually, and Simon Goldhill says this in his book, Foucault's Virginity, he says it's actually embedded with euphemism. Just at the very point where we think we're going to get something explicit, it's actually full of euphemism. The other novels, for example, Achilles Tatius, there's far more talk about sex. For example, in just as we get in Ovid Metamorphoses 3, in Achilles Tatius we get discussion of who has more pleasure from sex, men or women. And they talk about this at length in the boat, and there's all sorts of allusions to Plato's Symposium and so on. But we never get anything explicit. I don't think the novels would have survived had there been anything explicit, because the other ones didn't, given what they had to go through in antiquity.
And the emphasis on Chloe's virginity, especially in the parallel stories, is that very typical as well?
Absolutely. So, for example, to choose Achilles Tatius again, because they were kind of contemporaries, Leucippe must not have sex. Almost happens, Clyton gets up to whatever he wants, but Leucippe must not have sex, and there's even a virginity test at the end of the novel. Yeah, so in this template, the Greek novel template, the Parthenos must stay a Parthenos until she's married. Sorry.
Yes, I suppose the exception that proves the rule is Calirrhy, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that's true. Sorry, yes, that's true. Catatone. Yeah. Thanks. Good to have Judith here.
Sorry, gentleman at the back. Yeah.
When I read Longus, I was fascinated by the happened in the wood were shepherds' games, because shepherds don't go into woods. Sheep don't go into woods. Bucolic cows don't go into woods. There are no lady shepherds, there are boy shepherds, but even goats don't go into woods. So what on earth were the games that the shepherds were playing in the woods in which they weren't? Because the meadows is the plucking of virgins, the songing of the bucolics is from hillside to hillside, it's not in the woods.
Yep.
And so when we go into the woods, we might go with the bears, and we might have a bear's picnic in the woods, but we can't think of anything else that goes into the woods. And of course, what I thought about was that when Lawrence used the word sex, he invented a new meaning for it. Anybody who existed before Lawrence wouldn't have known that's what the word sex meant. It only became sex after Lawrence. So I was wondering, with your title of generic games, you're playing with genre, gender, and genus, and we can play with it to our heart's content.
You have summed up far better than I could what I was trying to say. Thank you. I had no idea that sheep didn't go into the woods. I mean, I may be from Scotland, but I did grow up in Glasgow. I had no idea. Why don't they go into woods? Ah, okay.
Of course, in Glasgow, you can go into the woods.
If you're not a sheep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Sorry. Let's go to that super short.
Thanks, Callum. Yeah, I didn't know about this possible allusion to Thucydides that you mentioned in the preface, the Katerma. So it looks interesting and would fit with your wider idea of sort of undercutting serious, high genres of literature. So I wondered what you and other people have made of that allusion, if it is one, and also does historiography, earlier Greek historiography, also get alluded to in other bits of the novel?
So to answer your first question, the preface is unusual in that it's set up by this author's voice, and then we get the narrative that follows. Lucian, of course, does the same thing. And it's historiographical, quite clearly, in the way that it's set out. We get the reason for the writing, we get some sort of didactic purpose, and this allusion to Thucydides, who, of course, was against writing for the famous passage. What Longus is bringing up is both historiography and philosophy, and the pleasurableness of fiction and the purpose of fiction. It's very much there. And this has been done to death by many people, and to someone who taught me, Fritz Gregor Hermann, has written an article on this kind of thing. On the second question, yes, historiography is there throughout the novels, but it's not something I particularly focus on. That's a rubbish answer. I couldn't give you any specific examples, but it's certainly there. Yeah. And I mean, you always go. Lucian writes a type of novel in this True Histories, and he's got far more historiography. He sees Herodotus burning in the Isles of the Damned for his lies, and then Lucian, of course, is, I won't end up there because I've said nothing false. Yep.
Any other questions? Yes.
I'm not sure if this has any relevance directly to your paper, but I don't often get a chance to talk to a Longus expert. In terms of the inset narratives, particularly the first and third narratives, which Daphnis tell, I think I'm right that they don't exist anywhere else in mythology. They're tales that exist only in Longus's Daphnis and Chloe.
Yeah, certainly the Fata one. The Echo one, of course, is in a few places, isn't it? I'm thinking of the Metamorphoses. I'm thinking of Aristophanes, but the Fata one certainly is the unusual one. There's the Pan and Pitys story is within the wood pigeon tale because that's what's been sung within the tale. Yes. So the Pan is there in any case. Sorry, I've interrupted.
No, it's if the answer is just no, then it stops there. What I was interested to explore, if these were unique tales, whether they were unique simply because, whether you felt they were unique simply because they're not recorded anywhere else, or they were invented by Longus, and if they were invented by Longus, was that a deliberate? Did he intend them to have been invented by Daphnis?
It's an excellent point. I don't think so. I think that Philetus would tell us far more if more of it survived. Certainly the way that the stories are set up, it's always they hear something and there's a reaction to it. And funnily with the Echo one, Daphnis has come across an echo before, but Chloe never has, even though they're always together, which is very odd. I would have to with the Fata one, there's a possibility that he is just on the spot extemporizing, like sort of epidictic oratory, but I don't think so. And I'll check Ewan Bowie's commentary because he will have the answer.
I think it's about time we let Callum off the hook at this point, and before giving him a drink, thanked him once again for a really super paper, which has prompted some very interesting discussion. There's a Stephen Sondheim musical called Into the Woods, which actually plays with the genre of fairy tales in a very interesting way. Everybody ends up in the woods one way or the next, and things change when you get there. I hadn't previously thought of that owing something to Longus, but I now wonder whether it doesn't. Anyway, thank you very much indeed, Callum. It's a super paper.